Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our Fresh Fair webinar today on Data Curation 101, maximizing the impact of your data. My name is Becky Boyles. I'm the co-PI of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group at RTI International in partnership with Renzi. I want to thank you for joining us today for this 10th installment of our webinar series. We will focus on providing an overview of data curation and its importance in enhancing HEAL's fair data principles, which we know are so critical to moving us forward in our HEAL data landscape. We will be followed this presentation by a panel discussion and Q&A from several data curation experts. If at any point you have a question, oh, goodness gracious today. Please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We have folks who are monitoring that box for us. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We are joined by Terrell Russell and Patricia Ceger of the HEAL Stewards. Terrell has a PhD and serves as Director of Data Management for Renzi, as well as Executive Director for the IRODS Consortium. He's interested in distributed systems, metadata, security, and open source software that accelerates science. Terrell has his PhD in information science from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Patricia Ceger is a toxicologist with over 15 years of experience using toxicological text data from laboratories, animals, humans, and ecological species to support regulatory decision-making. This includes validation and development of new approach methods in areas such as endocrine systems, acute toxicity, and aquatic toxicity. Her research interest includes ways to improve the fairness of toxicology data throughout the data lifecycle, including use of knowledge organization systems and outreach to stakeholders. And presenting today are Mary Hannah Currin and Bethany Cook of the HEAL Stewards. Mary Hannah Currin is a research data architect in the Research Computing Division at RTI International. She has experience in clinical research recruitment and database management, having worked over 4 years at the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities and coordinating recruiting efforts for a variety of research studies. Ms. Currin is also experienced in academic and specialized libraries. She holds an ALA accredited degree in information science and previously worked as a librarian at the RTP campus of US EPA. Ms. Currin is a member of the HEAL Stewards team and develops guidance for data management, curation, and strategy. So she may look familiar. Many of you may have engaged with some of these folks already. Bethany Cook is a computational chemist whose research interests are in understanding how we use information about chemical structure to predict the impact on biological systems. She uses reproducible workflows such as KNIME to support data curation focused on chemical exploration and risk assessment. With a background in analytical and computational chemistry, Bethany's goal is to reduce the strain of large-scale chemical testing with the use of computational methods and read-across data. She is a recent addition to RTI International and the HEAL Stewards. We're very pleased to have her, and her focus is helping to ease data access through curation needs. So with that, and the welcome for everybody joining this morning or afternoon, sorry, the day has gotten completely away from me. Hopefully folks have gotten lunch and we're afternoon time. And I want to pass it over to Bethany and Mary Hannah to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Becky, for that introduction. So for this presentation, we do have a few different objectives that we would like to go over before we get started. They are define the curation and its roles with research, identify curation strategies, discuss how curation contributes to fair data in the HEAL project, learn from investigators and researchers how they incorporate curation into their work and the resulting challenges and rewards. So with that being said, according to the National Library of Medicine, sorry, next slide, please. There we go. According to the National Library of Medicine, data curation is the ongoing process and maintenance of data throughout its life cycle to ensure long-term accessibility, sharing, and preservation. Data curation is composed of research data management and digital preservation and involves processes such as adding metadata to make data more findable and understandable, ingesting data into a repository, often a data repository, validating file checksums and file fixity checks, and other tasks for organizing, cleaning, describing, enhancing, storing, and preserving data. With all that being said, curation can be a never-ending task and requires the curator to understand and determine at what point their edits may no longer be beneficial. Next slide, please. There we go, thank you. So with all that being said, curation can be a lot. So before we get started with our full presentation, we'd like to go over a few different terms for curation, and that way we're all on the same page for interpretation. So data, we are referring to values and information gathered from analysis. Metadata is data that provides information about other data, such as column descriptions. Data dictionaries, which is the collection of metadata that helps describe that database and other related documents. Data collection, which is the process of gathering measurements on variables of interest. Data processing, which is manipulating data for classification and calculations. Data assessment, determining what data needs to be included or removed. And then common data elements, or CDEs, which is the standardization of questions and responses for equivalent analysis. Data coordinating centers, or DCCs, which is repository sites, and they're in charge of collecting, verification, and storage of data. And lastly with that is also standardization and harmonization. This is making sure that you have common terminology and formatting across all of your data and your text. So for example, making sure that your data has the same units or same capitalization and spacings throughout your document. Next slide. So with all of that, what exactly is curation? As I said before, curation looks different for everyone and is dependent on what step you are on in your pipeline. For an individual, curation could include, but is not limited to, documenting metadata and annotations so yourself and others can understand what data that you're actually looking at. Text harmonization, which is the first step, would most likely consist of making sure all your terms are formatted throughout the same in your document. This can be a huge factor when filtering and performing future analysis. For example, if you have, the sex of a mouse, you can represent it as male with a capital M, lowercase m, or just M. And so all of that is important to make sure that you have the same formatting with that. One of the most important curation efforts is at the individual level is quality control. I cannot emphasize enough how critical this step is, because if your data is not right at the source, any future work will automatically be invalid or questionable. Next with that, moving on to the global scale. What I mean by the global scale is when you start bringing in multiple documents from potential outside sources and being able to perform a complete analysis for your topic throughout these documents. On the global scale, it is important to have reliable data storage, so everything is available and accessible. It is also highly recommended to have interoperability, and this is making sure that you have that common connection between specific terms and when you're merging your documents. So for this could be making sure that you have the same pain scale, for example. If in one document, it's documented as severe pain, and then the other one is worst pain imaginable, are these the same scale? Are these equivalent values? So that can be a huge factor when making sure that you're looking at the right thing throughout your document. Also, with that, it's also helpful to make sure that your units and your values are harmonized across all of your documents. So if you're analyzing, you don't mix up 10 pounds and 10 kilograms, not realizing that they're not the same unit. Though individual and global curation are different, it is important to make sure you have consistent identities and formatting, and all of your values are validated. Sorry, go back 2 slides. One more. Thank you. Can you go forward 1 slide for the Venn diagram? Thank you. So as I was saying, so though individual and global curation are different, it's still important to make sure that you have consistent identities and formatting for both, and that your values are validated, because that you want to make sure that even if you're working with one or multiple documents, that everything is read appropriately by both a human and a computer. And that way you can have future analysis and nothing is misleading or fabricated. Thank you. Next slide. So for this, why exactly is curation important? Why should I care about it, basically? So the biggest thing with that is curation helps fix those simple everyday errors, because after all, we are only human. I know a huge thing for curation with me, and just kind of realizing how many typos a day I have. Even logging on my computer, I at least put my password in incorrectly at least once. I mean, it could be from just fast typing or sticky keys, basically. So if I'm doing that on a small scale, imagine throughout my entire data set how many typos we can have and not even realize it. So doing those small steps for that curation can be extremely important to making sure that your data is valid. Also with curation, it's important to make sure that your data is organized and easy to understand, whether you're working with one document or several different documents. If you're not having that metadata on describing what your columns are, and say you are the only one that knows what your columns are, what happens if you turn it over to a colleague? What are they looking at? They may interpret one column as, unique identifiers when you just kind of put random numbers and they do repeat. So it could be important to make sure that you have all that metadata. And this doesn't only apply to human readable, but it could also be when you go for future analysis through computer reading as well. And with all that, you also have the different types of curation. You have some automatic and you have manual curation. Your automatic can be your different workflows, different computer coding, things like that, to help do those systematic checks, making sure you don't have extra spacing, or making sure that the sex of your animals all spelled the same way. And then for your manual curation, this is making sure that all your values are realistic. One thing I like to do is easily graph my values to make sure I don't have a strange outlier that, I didn't type 1,000 when I only meant 100 and things like that. So that can play a huge role in making sure that all your values are validated and correct. Next slide, please. So an easy way to help remember curation steps is actually a curated model developed by the Data Curation Network. So for this, we have C, check files and code. So with this is just making sure that you are looking at the right files, you're pulling all the data appropriately and things like that. You understand the data, or try to at least. This is huge, making sure that you have those right metadata files, all your quality control checks are appropriate, because we all know with different coding or even opening Excel, things can always go wrong. So to make sure that you do have that data appropriately. Are requests missing information or changes? Being able to track those changes, realizing that, this value should have been in grams, not kilograms, something happened. It's always important to make sure that you find that information that's needed. Augment metadata for findability. So again, making sure that you have all those column headers labeled, and what do those column headers mean? There's times where you have, random _1 versus 2, or just all the random titles that you decide to call a column. It's helpful that you can spell out what that column actually consists of. T, transform file formats for reuse. This is making sure that you have the Excels versus CSVs. There's countless times I opened up Excels and all my cast numbers were changed to date. So making sure that you don't run into those issues all the time. E, evaluate for fairness. Mary Hannah is actually going to go a little bit more into fairness, but this is just making sure that you have that reproducible data and that it can be used throughout, basically. And then D, document all your curation activities throughout the process. So this is making sure that you do have all those track changes and things like that. So if you ever need to go back and be like, okay, where did this file get changed? What happened? Is this what we actually meant? You have a record of what was changed and when. Next slide, please. So with all of that, I've kind of gone over what exactly curation is and why it should be important, or why it is important. And so with that, I do have a few different helpful curation resources. Like I mentioned before, being able to graph those data points can be huge. And it doesn't have to be anything super complex. It's just kind of making sure that you identify any outliers or helping you realize, does my data make sense? So I actually do have a link here for Data to Viz. I personally like this website because it does show you a wide range of different graphs that you could use, not only for this curation purpose, but for other purposes as well. It helps you look at if you have numeric and categorical data, both combined, different combinations really, and what graphs may be appropriate for your data. Also, I do have a couple links for workflow development. So there's a couple of different ways you can do workflow development. You can either do code through R and R Studio or Python. I also do workflow development through KNIME. That's my personal preference. But either with that, the whole goal with that is to kind of make things easier on yourself. And you can do different workflows and help reduce and clean your data through automatic setup, as far as reducing some of those spaces, making sure all your spelling is appropriate, common mistakes that you catch throughout. But you don't even have to worry about that. You don't have to be tech savvy. Even going through Excel, doing, a change all once you realize that male is spelt 3 different ways, that can be huge in those curation steps. So with all that being said, I'd actually like to turn it over to Mary Hannah so we can now go into why curation is important for HEAL. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Hannah Currin, and like Bethany, I am a member of the HEAL Stewards Group, and I'm going to address curation in the context of the HEAL project. So curation is a very important part of the HEAL ecosystem, and it will help to make information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable or fair by improving the quality and accuracy of preserved data and metadata. And the process of curation addresses what information should be maintained that is both accurate and reflective of the original project. This will help future researchers get a better sense of a research study, its goals, the provenance or origin of research, and the resulting outcomes. Curation is also able to help in a very powerful way by facilitating the integration of many different kinds of data sets. And as we know at the HEAL project, there are lots of different kinds of data. And because of tools like common data elements, data from different types of studies can be compared by researchers. This presentation will help to give more insight into where curation fits into the HEAL data ecosystem and the different opportunities for curation for HEAL studies. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an image representing the HEAL distributed data ecosystem. Information moving from left to right shows metadata and data being sent to repositories, metadata being sent to the HEAL platform, and information being accessed through the HEAL platform by the scientific community that allows for search, analysis, collaboration, and discovery. While the movement of information helps to create this sophisticated ecosystem, it also presents a greater potential for mistakes as information is passed from one hand to the next. This is why curation is so important. As I have mentioned before, a goal of curation within this ecosystem is to help make HEAL data fair. Data curation activities require the use of different types of tools and metadata to describe, administer, and package research data. Curation activities can happen at many different points within this ecosystem, including with investigators, data repositories, and data coordinating centers. I'll now talk about some of these points of curation and other curation tools that can be used to improve the quality and accuracy of information in the HEAL ecosystem. Next slide, please. Investigators are the first step in this life cycle of curation by creating the study concept and design. As part of this design, they have the option of integrating policies and standards that will help to better curate their research data. This might include creating their data sharing policy or generating data dictionaries for their variable level metadata. Data coordinating centers can also be another line of defense for well-curated research data. For studies with DCCs, this will help with information management and provide another eye for editing and quality. Repositories can be a source of curation by providing curation services that check the data being ingested into the repository. However, not all repositories offer these services. The platform helps to curate information by automating part of the metadata submission process for your data. There are checks and balances in place to help make sure the data remains consistent and findable. Next slide, please. The next few slides are resources that can be used for curating your HEAL data. And you may be aware of these resources already, but this will better frame them in the context of curation and help you to start thinking about the ways that you can better treat your data. The data sharing and management plans might be newly required by NIH for some researchers, but DMPs have always been an incredibly helpful tool in planning for the future of your information. In many ways, this can lay the groundwork for the curation of research data and help to communicate to repositories the story of your data. Repositories play a role by helping with the longevity of your data, and the data management and sharing plan can help them better understand the information and the context that accompanies it. Next slide, please. Data dictionaries are a way to describe your variable level metadata, and they do this by decoding your information and defining elements within your data set. Data dictionaries are part of curation because they help to describe your information, and they may also need curation themselves. Anytime data is being created, there's always going to be the possibility for typos or mistakes. And there's no denying that curation is a time-intensive activity, but items like data dictionaries can provide enormous benefits by acting as a tool for reuse and supporting the longevity of your study information. Next slide, please. Common data elements are a combination of a definition of a field, how to collect that information, and the set of allowed responses. By using common data elements, researchers are able to improve the documentation for their study and allow for cross-study comparison. Using CDEs also provides an existing framework that can help limit mistakes. The use of CDEs takes us back to our discussion about the HEAL data ecosystem and how the platform will be able to successfully integrate research from different areas. As part of the Fresh Fair webinar series, there was a presentation on July 21st of this year entitled Common Data Elements Getting More Common All the Time, where presenters gave an overview of the Common Data Elements program for the HEAL pain clinical studies. If you're interested in more information about CDEs, I would suggest reviewing this presentation on healdatafair.org, and I believe it's been posted in the chat. And in addition to these pain CDEs, researchers can also apply additional CDEs to their research if appropriate. And the National Library of Medicine has a repository of CDEs that's also linked in this presentation. Next slide, please. Sometimes curation can be easier said than done, but the outcomes of curation will only benefit the scientific and greater community by providing more accurate information and allowing for the longevity and reuse of scientific information. This slide lists some additional curation resources for general information and more specialized consultation. And if you're a member of a university libraries can have wonderful resources on curating information, including librarians who specialize in data librarianship or health science librarianship. And these individuals are often very familiar with the standards and preparing information for ingest into repositories. Librarians can also be a great resource for helping you think through a data management and sharing plan. And even if you're not a member of a university, there are other curation resources that are available online, including through groups like the Data Curation Network that Bethany mentioned earlier. And they can help to offer tools and resources, including checklists for curating your data. NIH also provides guidance on their website for many of the topics that we discussed today. And now we're going to invite our panelists to join us for a moderated discussion. And I'll ask them to turn on their cameras as we stop sharing the presentation. And prior to going into this question portion, we were really interested in hearing some real life examples of curation for relatability. So that's going to be a bit of a focus today as people are answering these questions. And I will pass it over to Bethany to pose the first question.
Thank you, Mary Hannah. That was a great presentation. So with all that, the first question is actually to you, Mary Hannah. Do all HEAL data types, since we know there's about 20 different types of data in HEAL, need to undergo some level of data curation?
Yeah, I would say that it's never a bad idea to apply curation to your data, especially if your information is being submitted to a repository and you're wanting it to be accessed in some way. Making it as accurate and findable as possible is only going to benefit your research and the greater community as a whole. So there's different tools in place like the HEAL CDEs for clinical data that are geared towards a certain data type. And like we mentioned before, there's other CDEs that exist for other data types that can be implemented. So there's a lot of resources that exist for all different types of data. And the HEAL Stewards have also been working on developing more guidance for how to better curate your information, especially for specific data types. And I will now pick up the question asking, and I'm going to pose this question to Patricia. What is an example of good data curation, bad data curation, or errors that you would only find through curation?
Well, in general, good data curation or well-curated data sets are sets that are fit for purpose, right? They're curated well enough that you can analyze them and get meaningful data out of them. Well, bad essentially means that you're getting either incorrect data or not terribly useful data. Having said that, so some of the things that you might look for in a well-curated data set, as described by Bethany, you look for internal consistency. Where possible, you try not to use values that may cause platform or tool-specific problems or general problems like using one data type in a cell. So if you have a column of data that is all numbers and you suddenly put text in, that can cause problems for some analysis tools and languages. Other issues are things like using Greek symbols. They're commonly used in chemical names, and they can cause a real problem. We had a data set that was submitted to us where the experimenters were working with alpha estradiol and beta estradiol. They didn't provide any other identifiers for the chemicals. We read the chemical names into our program. The symbols got stripped out. We suddenly had 2 rows for estradiol, no way to tell which one was which, and they had very different data associated with them. It was a bit of a problem. So try to avoid those sorts of things. Again, spelling errors and typos can be real problems. If your boss comes to you and says, how many specific chemicals do we have? And you have atrazine spelled with an A and atrazine spelled with an I, that's a bit of an issue as well. Strange or incorrect values are an issue in bad data sets. So during her presentation, Bethany mentioned that you should check for things like, is this data consistent? I expect to see this number expressed as tenths or smaller values. But you also should be checking sort of for consistency across columns where appropriate. So for example, if you have a rabbit as your species and you see the weight for that rabbit reported as 2,000 kilograms, well, that rabbit won't fit into your laboratory. Somebody's made a mistake. You should also generally check for plausibility in your data. So we had a report and we actually did find out it was in the report. So the data was extracted faithfully. But the person who'd wrote in the report mentioned that they had 2 partially dead fish. Monty Python aside, not terribly useful. Another example was an inhalation data set we were given in which rats, excuse me, that's my doorbell, I'm sorry. Rats were inhaling a 1 cubed centimeter piece of wood. Again, not actually feasible. It was a problem. Then there are errors. So some of these errors I mentioned are things you would only find during curation. You're actually going through the data set. You're looking to see whether it's consistent and whether it makes sense. One of the things we found for a study we were doing is that the extractors had never seen a strange symbol that represents parts per thousand, the parts per mille symbol. Since they were reading in scanned PDFs, they just assumed it was an artifact and that was actually percent. So when we started looking through the values and we were getting these very inconsistent and strange values, we went back to the source material and then actually reached out to our subject matter experts to find out that that was a mistake. And it wouldn't have happened unless we were starting to look for those sorts of consistency. Also, for bad data sets, and this is just a general best practice, be careful that you know how your system works. So for example, Bethany mentioned the joys of working with Excel. Excel may autofill. It may also do odd things like accidentally when you drag down, because a value should be consistent down through several rows. If you're not careful, Excel says, oh, that ends in a number. I'll add to the number. And now instead of identifier 1, you have identifiers 1, 2, and 3. So for all of your bad data sets, really, they're not bad. They need cleaning.
Thanks, Patricia. I love the real life examples that you gave. I'm going to direct the next 2 questions to Terrell. And the first one is, can you talk about a time that you chose either manual or automatic curation and why?
Yes. So if automatic curation, I would say if automatic curation is on the table as a thing that you're interested in, or as a goal for the project or for the analysis that you're trying to do, it has to start at manual. So it's more of a progression. And I think understanding how far down that path you want to go is the same question is, how much effort do you want to put into this process? To get to fully automatic is a very generalized solution. You have to provide something that can basically take care of all of the types of crazy input that might appear, like a very large rabbit. If the large rabbit is going to trip up your automation, then you don't have a very good automation pipeline yet. And so there's still more work to be done, and there's still more effort to be, efforted, more time and money to be spent doing that. But that said, the workflows are most powerful if they can move at machine speed, right? So obviously the machines are much faster than the people, but the machines are dumb and they only do what we tell them to do. And if our instructions aren't very good, then you're back to garbage in, garbage out, which I think was mentioned before. So a couple specific examples, we definitely work with groups that have automated, 10s, 20 steps, 75 steps in their genomics pipeline, where things are coming off of a sequencer, and the data can be fairly consistent, and it can be assumed that the units are good, and things can be chopped up and segmented and parsed out to different teams based on all kinds of inputs. But those take a long time to automate, right? The first pass is definitely a human-based approach at human speed and human curation, making sure that things are sane and that the values make sense. The process to make them automated is very effortful, and it's a very expensive thing, but can pay off if you are at a certain scale and you've done this long enough that you have time to put into it.
Thank you. And the next question is a bit of a loaded question after the previous one, and it's also for Terrell. How long does it take to curate your data?
Oh, sure. So I'm going to cheat again and say, well, it's never done. Depending on what your goals are and what your organizational priorities are, what your policies demand, what your regulatory environment requires. I think it's always going to be a matter of being good enough. And so how long does it take you to get to be good enough? Well, now you've got to decide who's deciding whether it's good enough. That's usually a very highly paid position to make that decision, because if you get it wrong, then there could be large impacts. It really does depend on the stakeholders, who's in the room, like I said, the regulatory environment, and frankly, the stakes, right? If you're talking about COVID data that's going to be public and have an impact on policy in the next 2 days because the president's going to look at something and make a decision, how long does it take to curate that? You're going to need to make a very important decision very quickly. So you might want to bring in more people. You might want to make sure that all the tools are polished and everything is shiny and lined up just right. In general, the bigger the project, the longer it's going to take. But again, if you can automate some of that, then maybe the 50th time you do it, it doesn't take very long at all to curate your data, right?
Great, thank you. And the last moderated question I'm going to pose to Bethany. And that is, when should I be curating my data, at the start, throughout, or at study completion?
Thank you, Mary Hannah. Kind of reiterating what Terrell said, it's a never-ending process. So it's kind of depending on what level you're at on where you need to decide that curation needs to happen. Because if you're doing if it's your data doing the basic types of cleanup, it could be at the end of the workflow you're doing, after gathering all that data to begin with. And with that, you're going to start with like those basic tech curations, doing the capitalization, the spacing, things like that. We're kind of moving to your next step. It could be the very first thing that someone does that you hand that data off to. For the unit and term harmonization, especially if you're doing more of a global stretch, making sure that you have things like the synonym table, as Patricia mentioned, making sure that the spellings of your chemicals are all aligned through that synonym table, different things like that, or adding unique identifiers. We had a data set where even unique identifiers needed unique identifiers because of just once we looked at it, we were realizing that there was some inconsistencies and duplicates that needed to be happened. And so it kind of just varies depending on where you are. But definitely it helps to add that level of curation, whether you're about to hand off that data or you're first receiving it, so you can read it appropriately.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for participating in the moderated discussion. And now we're going to open it up to a live Q&A. And there is a Q&A box available in the bottom of the screen. So if you would like to post any questions there, And we already do have a question. I'm not exactly sure who to point this to, so I think I'll ask it more broadly to see if anyone has an answer. But the first question is, do you have tips on how to detect quote unquote invisible content, such as study ID only versus study ID with appended carriage return sign? And it regularly leads to, sorry, I lost my question. Regularly leads to problems when joining data in subsequent steps.
So I typed an answer.
Okay.
If you're looking for a programmatic type of a solution, most languages have something that can trim white space and, tab spaces, return characters, other hidden surprises, control characters. That might be an approach. There's also a Unix tool that can display there's all kinds of tools that can display, the control codes that might be hiding somewhere. So again, if you're trying to automate something and make it, to move at machine speed, you should probably look into these types of things. If it's a copy paste thing and it's a human scale, then maybe it's not as worth the time, right? But again, if you do automate this and you start stripping things out, you really don't want to strip out the alpha and the beta, because that's totally what happened.
Yeah, kind of to add to what Terrell was just saying, I've done this a couple times in NIME. They have a string manipulation. So I would kind of just run my Excel through the workflow. And it can literally just be read Excel in, do the string manipulation, and it deletes all those extra white spaces. And you can identify new tabs and things like that to make sure you're seeing all the data.
Awesome, thank you both. And the next question is sort of HEAL related. Do HEAL curators at repositories have specific documented workflows? And I'm not exactly sure. I guess if we're talking about repositories as in the HEAL compliant repositories that we are suggesting that you submit your information to, there are a lot that have documentation about how you submit information to them. As far as curation services, it really varies based on the repository. So some repositories do have curation checks. They're able to check your data, able to manipulate it so that it best fits within that repository, and do spot checks. But some repositories don't offer that, and sometimes it's for a fee. So it really depends based on the repository. And again, the HEAL stewards are here to help you best select a repository for your information, because we know it varies so much based on the researcher. And while it is unfortunate that some repositories have better documentation than others, a lot of them do have really good resources and tutorials. And question number 3 is a follow-up question. Does HEAL have a central place for those? And yes, there is a list of recommended repositories on the HEAL website. And we are happy to point you to that, and we can follow up with it. Thank you, after this presentation. So all of these repositories are HEAL compliant, so they comply with the HEAL data sharing policy. And selection is based off of data type. So there's some generalist repositories, as well as repositories that are geared more towards different specific data types. We usually recommend that people go with the more specific repository if they do have one that fits them. But again, the stewards are here to kind of have discussions with researchers if they need any additional guidance. And thank you for dropping that link into the chat. Okay, we have our final question. So what is your take on the complexity of curated data sets? For example, would you recommend to convert a time diff object into the number of elapsed days as a numeric variable?
I would say that in general, all relative measurements are going to be the enemy of you eventually. If you can make things standalone, either by providing an actual timestamp, or if it does need to be, elapsed days since the beginning, that should probably be a number as well. But yeah, diff based stuff, if it loses its context, now you're sunk. You've lost the ability to know what happened. Yeah, and same thing with nested data sets where they refer to themselves and things like that. Sometimes it's more efficient, but if the data is good, the computer can always do a relative. The math is not hard. The computer can do the math for you later. The absolute values should be something that you seek.
That's fair, Terrell. To kind of add to that as well, I've worked with data sets where you kind of need that range as well, especially when working with summary level data. I found it most helpful. So if you have 1 to 10, if either you list it as that and look for that identifier all the time, or you put those in 2 different cells. So you have a high range and a low range, so you can clearly distinguish the differences. That can also help as well.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. And I'm going to pass it back to Becky for closing remarks. So we're going to stop sharing our screens and reshare the presentation. And thank you all again.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending this afternoon. I hope you've left here with some additional resources and also just a general appreciation for something that is often not discussed or elevated, but is critical to our work going forward in data curation and making data fair in the HEAL ecosystem. So in addition to recording of this webinar, we'll also email everyone who's registered for this event a list of resources that will assist you in participating more deeply in the HEAL ecosystem and hopefully help answer any questions you might have. This slide deck will be shared in a link to our Slack channel, and connect with us form are located in the chat. We hope that you'll reach out to us, the HEAL Stewards, for questions or support as you embark upon your FAIR journey and to maximize the value of HEAL data. So really thank you all for attending, and thank you all speakers and panelists. I should say, not to overlook, that we look forward to our next webinar on October 20th. So mark your calendars, focused on how to register your study on the HEAL platform. So please mark your calendars, and there will be information forthcoming about that event. Thank you all.